Okay, thank you everyone for being here and for your patience. And for your patience in advance. I think I might be more awkward and incoherent than usual for 3 reasons. The first one is that this is only my second meta performance in front of a camera. So a meta performance, I guess, is when we're aware that we're performing. Now, we know in the social sciences that we're always performing dramaturgically some kind of social role, but then when we gain that kind of meta-awareness, in the meta-awareness that we're aware that we're performing, it gets really awkward. The second reason is that this is really embarrassing, but I feel I have to mention it. I'm quite heartbroken. I lost a dear friend. It may sound silly, but I lost a puppy dog who was my very, very dear friend since September, who had grown up with my son and myself. So I'm, like I said, quite heartbroken. At the same time, I'm also thankful that my dear lost friend, Echo, has of late taught me things about feeling phantom pains outside my body. So as it happens, I think this bears some relevance to the subject of bodily consciousness that I hope to talk about. The third reason why I might be a bit incoherent is that I have way, way too many things to talk about, and I don't want to bore you for too long. So I may just brush upon some of these really complicated ideas a little bit too fast. So by all means, do interrupt, do ask if I'm not making any sense. So I've heard from very intelligent people that my title was a little bit intimidating or incoherent or perhaps a little bit pompous. So hopefully what I can proceed to do today is try to unpack and also justify that title. So very briefly, let me proceed backwards. So somatic perception, soma is the body, right? So bodily awareness, bodily consciousness. Tele means mediated at a distance, right? So I'm talking about how bodily perception can be mediated at a distance. Then interpersonhood, for anthropologists, might be something of an oxymoron. We can only be persons by entering in contact with other persons. We learn to be persons through others. However, we may be in a particular predicament in the West whereby some of us have forgotten that. So as much as it's an oxymoron, it's probably important to at least introduce that inter, and then afterwards we can get rid of it. Virology sounds like one of those fashionably, perhaps vacuously, postmodern affixes or metaphors, which, however, I insist might be necessary, and I have chosen that word carefully. So I was thinking of, well, the ways in which we socially and at a distance come to become persons, what it feels like also in one's body to be a person. And I was thinking of the epidemiology of how we become persons. I had wanted to talk about epidemics of personhood, why we have epidemics of ways of being a person that hold in a particular place at a particular time. But it struck me that epidemiology might be a little bit too vague. So I thought about maybe bacteriology or parasitology. But then I thought, no, that's also not very good, that's not very accurate. I don't want to convey the notion that, for example, ideas or representations are actually out there like bacteria. They live in some kind of host. They travel through some kind of vectors. So we have some airborne viruses, but they don't survive for very long on the outside. So here I'm concerned with those viruses of personhood that persist, or that infect certain people in some moments and in some times. And then when we think of virology, we have to think of the vectors then. So for example, say, if we examine the way some people might catch some airborne diseases in hospitals, by examining the air conditioning system, we may realize that, again, there are vectors, really sterile vectors that carry viruses, right? So in other words, I'm asking questions about those vectors, or in other words, about culture. So here's what I intend to talk about today. I may not get to talk about everything. In fact, I don't really have slides for the end of my presentation. I'll have to either forget about it or improvise. But first, I want to go over once more brief definitions of self and consciousness that we've already explored, those of us who were in the first seminar. Then I want to propose a weird definition of the self and ask a tough question about culture. And here I will quote my distinguished colleague in anthropology, Professor Alan Young, who recently confessed that we have this sort of grotesque embarrassment in the field of anthropology, where we're supposed to have compelling things to say about culture, and yet we have no idea what it is. So then I'll proceed to do a little rhetorical trick that psychoanalysts, anthropologists, and some species of psychiatrists are fond of doing, which is to examine seemingly weird, pathological, extreme experiences and proceed to show that they're not that weird at all. So this is what we call making the strange familiar. And then go back and ask questions about things that we take for granted, like for example, the inner voice inside our head, or what it feels like to be me, Samuel, or you, Eric, or Ademola, and realize that it is quite weird. Then I'll briefly talk about hypochondria. So these are hypochondriacs, people with supposedly imaginary illnesses, who frantically Google their symptoms and who discuss them online as a paradigm for interpersonhood, for mediating sensory experiences. I'll propose another weird definition of culture. And then I'll talk about Tulpanancy, which I had assigned a reading, which some of you may have had a look at, on varieties of Tulpa experiences. So very briefly, I'll return to that. Tulpa is an idea or practice taken from Tibetan Buddhism, but it's more of a, not exactly New Age, but a contemporary subculture of young people who conjure imaginary friends using visualization and somatization techniques. Imaginary friends that are said or claimed to have achieved sentience. So people who experience multiple selves living in their body in absolutely, in my view, non-pathological ways. Right? And I will propose that Tulpamancy is a very creative, very interesting, very compelling way, or paradigm or model, to think about how interpersonhood or culture actually works, how we mediate the symptoms of each other's personhood. Yes, Eric?
I had a quick question. You might get to this later, so it's okay if you don't answer it right now, but what do you mean by imaginary when you use like imaginary in contrast to real or in contrast to
Right. So usually people who are not actually there, people that you don't actually know physically, right?
Yeah.
So obviously we can talk about, how improvisation necessarily entails drawing upon a cultural, etc. repertoire, right? I mean, whether or not there's such a thing as a new idea, I don't know, I can't comment on, but imaginary friends, the way children in many cultures, including what we call Western cultures, they speak to imaginary friends, right? And then for some reason or other, they're discouraged, they have to say goodbye to their dear friends because it's considered, it's not serious, and then if you do that when you're a bit too old, then it's considered pathological. And then I shall conclude. Okay, so. Yes, you had a question, Ademola?
Is it a taking for granted assumption that all cultures have, this notion of imaginary friend? That's the question I was also asking.
So that I'm not sure. I think in all cultures, people speak to all kinds of agents, human, animal, imaginary, and not. And what is considered normal and pathological depends from culture to culture. Certainly in the Western folk scientific and scientific paradigm, it is not considered serious when you're an adult to speak to an imaginary person, right? So I'm going to very, very briefly review different ways of viewing the self, different ways in which we have talked about the self. And here I am sometimes using self and person interchangeably. I realize that may be problematic for some people. So very briefly, I'll talk about a transcendental model, the mental model, and the 4EA, right, approach it. And I'll focus on, well, first of all, when we talk about a person, what is the seat of personhood? Where is it? Is it in the brain? Is it in the head? Is it in the chest? Is it in the kidneys, in the foot, in the table, right? And we often talk of selves and persons as bundles of mental states, bundles of emotions, bundles of affects, bundles of chromosomes, bundles of bacteria. We're told how many billions of bacteria do we have in the gut again? I mean, this is one of those new ways of talking about cells. So in any case, there is a muddle, many ways of talking about what cells are. So the first view, which I call transcendental, and on which I shall not dwell for too long, is basically the idea that there's some sort of an eternal soul that presumably existed before you were born, before the body was born, a soul for which the body is a vessel, right? And a soul that lives on in some form of afterlife. Now, in the social sciences, it has become fashionable, perhaps in the past 50 years, to blame this on Descartes, right? The so-called Cartesian mind-body split dualism. Then when we do a little bit of history of those ideas, we usually run it through Augustine, who sort of Christianized the Platonic worldview. And then we blame it on Plato, right? Who posited the actual independence of ideas. From an anthropological perspective, particularly from a cognitive anthropological perspective, however, it is a little bit condescending to say that this is an exclusively Western predicament. I, for one, have yet to encounter an actually monist culture. So monism is the absence of dualism, where everything is made of the same stuff, where the mind is not so much embodied, but it can be explained in terms of material processes. Now, monism may be one particular moral or epistemological profession of faith in certain sciences and schools of philosophy, but if we examine the cross-cultural record, most humans tend to be dualist. So here I'm not making any kind of ontological statement about whether or not there are such things as soul. I'm simply noting that, for example, varieties of what we call shamanism or animism, but even very many varieties of Buddhism and Hinduism and reincarnation, there is a transcendent soul that existed before. So the person was there before the temporary body vessel was born and then lives on afterwards. So I'm not going to touch on this very much. So the second is the mental view of the self, which is probably one of the most dominant views of the self in our everyday scientific and folk scientific ways of talking about selves, particularly in the West. So this is a view that at least attempts not to be dualistic, which, as we will see, attempts to ground mental states in some sort of either neural correlates or somatic experiences. But the central aspect of this mental view of the self is usually attributed to the Enlightenment philosopher John Locke, who spoke of, well, we know that there's a self when there is a sense of psychological unity and continuity. So this is again an old philosophical paradox, right? The paradox of sameness in change. Why is it that 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, I was a child, and my body has changed dramatically, and yet I feel like I'm still the same person? Well, in fact, I, for one, do not, and I'll speak of this perhaps. But this is the view that pervades in philosophy, in the philosophy of mind, in cognitive science, and in neuroscience. Right? So looking for this continuity. So self is usually linked with her memories, her autobiographical or diachronic memory. And there are many paradigms in psychology, in philosophy, in neuroscience, and so forth, of this autobiographical inner voice self, how we narrate our own existence. And we think of the self as this actual linguistic, spoken, narrating voice inside our head. So this particular view of the self is usually located, well, in the mind, or in the head, or in the brain, or now in particular neural substrates. So there is what some of us term a very cortex, or frontal cortex, or front brain-centric view of the self. So there are many different kinds of cortical midline structures in which, some neuroscientists claim to have found signatures of the self. by which they probably mean some kind of a narrative self, but we're going to get this. We're going to get to there. So, any neuroscientists here? I don't know, Ishan, can you give us the names of...
medial middle prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, spinal cortex, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and dorsolateral prefrontal.
Good, nice. Okay.
Pass.
So these, the ventromedial and dorsolateral, are interesting because there's also debates about, some of them might be more conscious, unconscious, etc. But yes, so these.
Is that how they're all connected?
Yes. This is how they're all connected. Okay. So, and then in some strands of more phenomenological schools of thought, so phenomenology is, well, it's many things to many different people. For many social scientists, it's something to do with lived experience. For others, it's something to do with somatic experiences. Something to do with experience and being in the world, right? So we speak of the mind or the self being embodied, being embedded, enacted, extended, affective. And these are all really beautiful images and metaphors to work with, but it sometimes gets a little bit difficult to talk about, well, where exactly is it? We want to know, right? So is it in the mind, the heart, the foot, the shoe, the computer, right? So for the extended mind, scholars like the early N.D. Clark and his natural-born cyborgs, technology is an extension of our skills, it's also an extension of our minds. Right? So I'm not going to dwell on those too much, although I will ask questions about, well, in what way exactly can we talk of the self being extended? So other very simplistic and common divisions that we speak of when we speak about the self is differences between the unconscious and the conscious part of the self. And this was a distinction perhaps first elaborated on by William James, right, who spoke about the difference between the me and the I. So the I is that which at any given moment is conscious. So I right now am conscious that I'm Samuel, that I'm only mildly embarrassing myself in front of you fine ladies and gentlemen. And I'm also aware that I am this me, this much more complex, elusive bundle of chromosomes and bacteria and memories and a whole bunch of automated processes to which I have no conscious access. So then when we get into trying to define this me, then we have a much bigger philosophical problem. So for the mentalist cognitive scientists, like Daniel Kahneman, for example, right, there's been many ways of theorizing different kinds of unconscious and conscious processes. And here, I'm not touching on psychoanalysis and even the works of Freud that also very famously gave us the idea of the unconscious to work with. Right? So the me and the I. But many scholars make distinction between intuitive processes, so sort of automatic inferences that we make all the time without being aware that we make them, and then reflective processes. So usually a reflective process, I can narrate it in my head with some kind of language that I speak, right? So Kahneman speaks of system 1 versus system 2 cognition. So, of course, we could keep adding layers to this unconscious, conscious selves, right? I think a very important part of the unconscious self is what we term intentionality, and we've spoken quite a bit about intentionality already, often translated as aboutness, or the capacity of our minds or self to represent, to think about, to intend, to project, right? Teleology or goal-directedness sometimes is another way in which we describe intentionality. But then, of course, well, there's something missing from this picture, and well, the body, for one, right? So, what about what people like Ned Block and many other philosophers, like Dan Zahavi, call phenomenality? So this is what it is like, what it feels like. Or, in very simple terms, bodily awareness, bodily experience. And here it already gets a little bit more muddled because, well, am I aware of my body? In what ways am I aware of my body? I mean, if I caress the tip of my finger, I can feel it. If I enter a semi-meditative state or my mind wanders, I can start maybe feeling my foot in ways that 2 minutes ago I was not aware of my foot. So bodily awareness is sometimes conscious, sometimes unconscious. So I put it sort of a little bit away from the middle, right? So intentionality can also be broken down into many, many more ways of what particularly philosophers of language call propositionality, having propositional attitudes, all the what-ifs, right? So, but again, most scholars would situate propositionality as some sort of a linguistic property, only for those beings that have language, that think in terms of language. But I, for one, think that a lot of large brain mammals, certainly, and probably a lot of sentient beings, are, in my view, candidates for propositionality. They make all kinds of what-if inferences, perhaps not with language, perhaps thinking in other ways, but so where is it? And then meta-intentionality is, well, you know, if I'm thinking with words, I'm trying to ask questions, I wonder if Maxwell is bored right now. You know, I wonder if he's thinking that I'm thinking that I'm thinking, right? So, but there are many scholars. So Ned Block is one of them. He's a philosopher. Antonio Damasio, the neuroscientist. Sean Gallagher. They have basically those two kinds of consciousness, right? So phenomenal consciousness, the sort of pre-reflective, somatic, and whatever consciousness, and then access consciousness, whatever we can have conscious access to, like William James's eye. So many of you know that I'm quite fond of anthropologist Maurice Bloch's attempt to reconcile cognitive, scientific, and anthropological notions of the self, because it turns out that for those of us who are familiar with anthropology, a very common trope is, well, the self is a very recent, modern Euro-American invention. It has something to do, a lot to do, in fact, with the rise of capitalism, with the Protestant Reformation, with the propagation of an individually mediated relationship with God, individual pursuit of happiness, and then selfishness, fragmentation, and so forth. But the self is a modern construct. As anthropologists, we're very comfortable with making this claim. I, for one, am not, because I'm compelled to ask, well, do we want to deny sentience to people prior to the Industrial Revolution in Europe? Do we even want to deny sentience or phenomenality, what to animals, to non-human animals? So this is why I like Maurice Bloch, and this is, from now on, these are my own definitions, I like to add more layers to this bundle, right? So again, for Damasio, there's a minimal self and there's a narrative self, or a phenomenal or narrative for others. I think I like to speak of core consciousness, which is something that I'm convinced is shared by all sentient beings. And there's phenomenality, sentience, body and world awareness. Many scholars like to say that phenomenality entails a sense of ownership of one's body. There I step in as an anthropologist and say, I'm not sure. Separating oneself from one's body, the owner, that implies some kind of a ghost in a machine, some kind of a central command, I'm not sure. So then we go into those minimal aspects, which again, I will venture are shared by certainly many large-brained mammals, or perhaps all creatures with brains and central nervous systems. Intentionality, this sort of aboutness, goal-directedness, and also intersubjectivity, being co-constituted with others. And then we get into narrativity, different styles of narrating the self. Certainly for us humans, symbolic, linguistic creatures, we are enskilled. Narrativity is enskilled or inbrained into us in ways that most of us now associate ourselves with that inner speaking voice. But if you have read the assigned Against Narrativity paper or manifesto by the philosopher Galen Strawson, Strawson is one of those rare Western thinkers who basically attacks this idea that in order to be a self, one needs to feel this sense of psychological continuity. So Strawson very famously claims that there are people who are episodics. There are people who feel like they were different people in different moments of their lives or in different moments throughout the day. So I, for one, if I reread something that I wrote years ago, it feels like it was an entirely different person. I look at myself in the mirror, I do not recognize myself physically from before. I feel that for all intents and purposes, I am, and I have been, multiple selves. Right? So I'm not going to get into a lot of depth now, but Maurice Bloch, the anthropologist, reading Gale and Strawson, said perhaps what anthropologists ought to mean when they say that there's no such thing as selves in other cultures, perhaps we ought to mean, well, there are different styles of narrativity. There are different ways of narrating the self. There may be cultures that are more prone to episodicity. So, yes?
I don't have to say this briefly. 2 weeks ago or so, I had a patient she's 76, and she's Italian origin, and she's grown up here. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And she had a memory of herself as a child.
Okay.
Right? And at 76, the problem she had, was this understanding of the self as a continuity.
Okay.
Right? She kept asking, where did that child go? So I guess the reason why I bring it up is just to problematize what you're saying further. Well, it's not really just so-called non-Western culture. Maybe within the West itself, there might be individuals like you who have, for whatever reason, have experiences that I suggest too, that maybe they're truly episodics in our cultures.
Sure. But in our current biomedical diagnostic cultures, we have tended to pathologize it.
You get the PCC.
Yeah.
Okay. It's very temperamental.
Sorry, yeah. It's decided not to work anymore.
It's being very episodic.
It's being very episodic, yeah. So hopefully, yes, go on.
Sorry, I do have a question.
Oh, of course, please.
I'm just trying to...
In fact, I want to make a question, I'll try to fiddle with this.
So, I had a question. So basically what I gathered, just to clarify, and then I actually have a more specific question. You would say that this kind of core minimal narrative thing maps onto sort of a continuum of cognitive capacity or development, right?
Yeah.
And I guess then the more specific question is you make, so I'm trying to think, I guess the hardest thing for me to differentiate is between core and minimal in this sense, because if intentionality is unconscious, it's unconsciously motivated. I'm not sure how you make a clear difference between sort of sentience, what is just sort of being alive and being and still having a capacity for kind of reflexive action. If not reflective action, but just at least reflexive action. And intentionality as sort of like just an unconscious set of motivations or goal-directed templates for action.
Right. So I'm going to get there in a minute, and I'm going to problematize this notion of the minimal self. I think intentionality is largely unconscious and automatic because I think of it as a basic mechanism for what we could call inter-subjectivity, right? So, for example, or for what some cognitive scientists like to call mind reading, which upsets the phenomenologist, but which I think works quite well. So we have an increasing amount of good experimental evidence that completely pre-linguistic human babies are really excellent at picking up on others' communicative intent. They're able to perspective take, right? They're able to put themselves in the perspective of somebody else. They're able to sort of project themselves mentally, right, or travel through space and see the world from the perspective of another agent. And so this is why it's not reflective. It can be done reflectively, but it's something that's there. It's minimal, and so why I don't situate it in the core, perhaps because we have a lot of animals who are not as social as we are. They seem to not be as good as humans or as other species, like maybe dogs or some of the great apes or elephants, pigs, etc.
Yeah, I guess I just think of the case of sort of superorganisms as being something that's hard for me to place very neatly. I mean, obviously they don't perspective take in the way you're saying, I guess, but they're social.
Right.
Like ants or bees or, I mean...
Yeah, I find it difficult, perhaps, perhaps for inbuilt phylogenetic reasons, to relate to ants and to perspective take. I think it's counterintuitive. It's possible to be done, but it takes some really strongly disciplined counterintuitive traditions like Jainism and so forth to be able to do that.
Right. But if I think of the bee dance, for instance, then we get an interesting set of problems.
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, they dance to show where the precise position of honey is.
Yeah.
So in that sense, they're actually communicating a whole set of information that can be read as sort of perspective taking and so forth. It's useful for
Sure.
going somewhere else. It's fine. Then it seems that seems a radical jump outside of sort of backboned social mammals.
Right.
When bees are included.
But